Okay, let's quick go over Chapter 10 vocab. Just 10A is what we're going to go over today. I'm going to make this pretty short and sweet. So first one here, she used to want, is quería. Now remember, this is the imperfect tense that we're seeing here. So this guy comes from the verb querer, which means to want. Now in the present tense, he or she wants is quiere. Remember, we've got an E to IE stem change in the present tense. Preterite, this is an irregular. What's the irregular that goes there? He or she wanted that one time would be quiso. And remember, there's no accents because accents don't, irregular verbs in the preterite tense don't get accents. And then we see quería. All right, the next one. He or she was 17 years old. Tenían 17 años. Now, our actual verb in this is tenía. And so that comes from the verb tener, to have, because remember, when we're talking about age in Spanish, we're going to say that I have this many years. So in this case, I have 17 years. Present tense, we want to say he or she is 17. We would say él tiene 17 años. I should turn my Spanish keyboard on. All right. Tiene 17 años. Now, the preterite tense, I'm not going to fill it out on this one because this phrase, he or she was 17 years old, if we're talking about age in Spanish, we are always going to go to the imperfect tense, which seems kind of counterintuitive because the preterite, we always say, is for specific times. But because I'm not even going to explain why. Just if it's an age and you're talking about how old someone was, how old you were, you're going to keep that in the imperfect tense. You'll never use that phrasing in the preterite. Okay, so just keep that in mind. He or she used to smell like. Repiten, olía a. Olía a. Now here, olía is he or she used to smell, and the like is a. So, olía a pez. He or she used to smell like fish. Bueno, so you just fill in the blank. Our verb here is to smell, and that comes from oler. Bueno, oler. Now, in the present tense, oler, you can probably tell just from looking at the infinitive. In the present tense, it's a stem changer, but it looks really funky because it starts with an O. So if you want to say he or she smells like, we would say huele a. But let's quick write out the chart on the back of your paper for that one, because again, the present tense just looks a little bit different because it is an O to UE stem change in the present, but we can't just start with the U in Spanish, so we're going to start with the H. Bueno, so I smell is huelo, you smell is hueles, he or she smells is huele, we smell is olemos, because remember, in the present tense, stem changes happen in the boot, and so the nosotros form is outside of that. And then they smell is huelen. Again, I'd write that chart on the back of your vocab sheet. In the preterite tense, oler is a regular verb. There's nothing weird about it. So how would we say he or she smelled like that one time? Olió. Bueno, olió a, I should say. Now, if we're looking at preterite versus imperfect, I don't know. My grandpa always used to smell like peppermint. Now, that's the imperfect tense, right? That's what he used to smell like. But yesterday, he smelled like BO, right? So like that's not normal. He usually smelled like peppermint, but for whatever reason, yesterday, he smelled like BO. So that, remember, that's the difference between the preterite and the imperfect. And the next one, almost, casi. And it's not a verb, so we can't conjugate it. You've actually seen that word already. If you think back to Spanish 2, the first book that you ever read was called Casi se muere. He or she almost dies. So you did see casi then. The next one, he or she blushed, is se puso rojo. Now, literally, we're not actually saying blushed. Literally, this translates as he or she put on redness, which, again, in English, we would say he or she blushed. So our verb here is really ponerse. So we're taking poner, which means to put, and we're turning it into a reflexive verb because then that makes it to put it on yourself, right, onto oneself. So we want ponerse here, and that's the verb that we're going to be conjugating. So he or she blushes is se pone rojo. In the present tense, poner is almost a regular verb except for the yo form. So if I want to say I blush, me pongo. Remember, it is a go verb. Otherwise, it's a regular verb. Preterit tense, se puso, right? So remember, poner is an irregular verb in the preterite tense, which means we're not going to see any accents. Here's that chart for you. I'd probably recommend writing this down because my guess is you've more or less forgotten it. So I put on in the past, me puse, te pusiste, se puso, nos pusimos, and se pusieron. Then the imperfect tense, he or she used to blush. We're going to write, so put it into the imperfect, it's an ER verb, right? So he or she used to blush, se ponía rojo. Regular verb in the imperfect tense. There's nothing weird about it. Now, if we look at preterite versus imperfect here, I always think about Maggie Aiden when I think about this phrase in the imperfect tense, because if you remember Maggie, she would blush at like the drop of a hat. Like, didn't matter what happened, she was always blushing. And so when I talk about Maggie and her blushing, I would talk about her in the imperfect tense because Maggie always used to blush, right? And that's the imperfect. That's different than saying, I blushed yesterday when I slipped on the ice, right? Or when I was embarrassed, because that's a specific instance. Imperfect, remember, that's over the next, or that's over like a large period of time. Okay, he or she could breathe is podía respirar. So he or she could is podía. Respirar is to breathe, like respirate, right? That would be your cognate. The verb we're actually conjugating here is podía, and that comes from poder, which is to be able to or can, is sometimes what we say. In the present tense, he or she can breathe. It's going to be puede respirar. Remember, in the present tense, it is an O to UE stem change. Stem changes in the present happen in the boot. In the preterite tense, poder is an irregular verb. Try to think about what is the irregular stem for that. Pudo. Oops, we don't want that highlighted. Pudo respirar. Remember, it's an irregular, so we're not going to see any accents on it. I'm going to quick write that chart out for you. So I could, pude, pudiste, pudo, pudimos, pudieron. Preterite versus imperfect here. I couldn't breathe yesterday when I got the candy stuck in my throat. Versus he couldn't breathe well because he had asthma, right? The chronic condition that's over a long period of time versus yesterday. And then the final phrase here is they lived happily ever after. We're not going to conjugate it, anything like that, because it's just what the phrase means. And they lived happily ever after is vivieron felices y comieron perdices. We will translate it as they lived happily ever after. If we were going to literally translate it, it does say they lived happily and ate partridges. I don't know how to spell partridges, but not like that apparently. Partridges. There you go. So that is the literal meaning. They lived happily and ate partridges, but for the sake of English, we're going to just say they lived happily ever after. So there is your Unit 10A chart. Hopefully that at least ran you through it, gave you the charts that you need to have on the back. So if you have questions when you get back, please let me know.